Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to, I believe, webinar number 5 in our series of Navigating the COVID-19 Crisis. This is April the 17th, 2020. I want to encourage each of you to look closely at our hashtag, We Keep Leading, and continue to tweet out your comments and your information as we all continue to learn from each other at this very unprecedented time that we continue to find ourselves in. As you can see today, we continue to have our distinguished panel of speakers, which I will introduce individually in just a moment. But let's move to take a look at the agenda and what we have in store for you today. We did talk about going through our FAQ. We are continuing to work on that, but we did pluck some questions out. So as you can see, we are going to do some reminders, get our updates from Washington, and then we're going to move into talking about extended school year, as we've received many questions along those same lines. So with us today, and we will have Q&A as well at the end. So let me move into introducing our panelists, distinguished guests of today. Erin Maguire is our case president from Vermont. Myrna Manlawitz, who is our case policy and legislative consultant from Washington, D.C. Dr. Kevin Rubenstein, our policy and legislative chair from the state of Illinois, and Julie Weatherly with resolutions in special education, and Julie resides in Alabama. I want to personally thank each of them on behalf of CASE, our executive committee, and all of our board of directors for all of the work that they have done to date, and as we have all committed to do from this point forward to provide you support and resources, again, as we navigate through this crisis. I will just say, yes, I'm Phyllis Wolfram, the case executive director, and thank Megan and CEC, Megan Shea and Jen Bullock, who have been our partners in producing our webinars. It's important that I share with you today that the information we're providing is the best we know at this moment. You are living changes every day. So what we say today might be changed tomorrow. It could change next week. It could change in a month. It could change by the time the webinar is over. But we will continue to provide you, to the best of our knowledge, the information and the updates that come our way. Next, I'd like to show a brief video that I hope brings a smile to your face. It does mine. It's a favorite of our case president, Erin Maguire. So remember, we're all in this together. So as you can see, though we may not be embracing each other, we are embracing change. We must embrace change. So I hope you enjoyed that. I hope it brought a smile to your face. When we saw it this week, we were all laughing and enjoying a wonderful moment of sharing some smiles. Moving forward, I would like to remind you of our 4 priorities for special education at this point in time. First and foremost, we want you to continue to focus on your health, the health and safety of our students and your staff members in your community. We'll continue today to talk about FAPE. We want to encourage you to deliver those services to as many students as you can and in the best possible way that you know how, with the resources, of course, that you have. Number 3, to document your efforts. Make sure your documentation is, again, focused, consistent, detailed, and demonstrates that good faith effort to provide good services. And 4th, compliance during this pandemic. Remember, you need to keep reminding yourself, IDEA was not built to be implemented at a time of a national, international pandemic and a crisis that our country is facing. So we encourage you to really put that in perspective as you move forward in providing services to our students with disabilities. Next, acting to support flexibilities. We think it is very important that we continue to look at what we are doing to provide, or what we're requesting to provide temporary and targeted flexibility, because that's what's necessary as we do our jobs. As you know, CASE has sent a letter to our congressional leaders that support those flexibilities. We've outlined those to you in our letters. We've shared that. It's on our website. And there is a link here to for you to find that letter as well. We have begun to share it on social media, and we would ask that you do the same. We would ask that you be astute to those tweets, and in every positive manner, continue to note the flexibilities that we're requesting for our field, for everyone that's implementing, the boots on the ground people, our teachers who are there every day working their best to provide the services to our families. It's important that you know, because as you look at social media, there have been some misunderstandings and miscommunications. CASE does not support waivers of IDEA in any way. We intentionally have looked at how can we present temporary and targeted flexibility, and with temporary, we have requested timelines around that. Next, as we talk about temporary and targeted flexibility, we need your help to get the message out there. Again, if you would go to this site for CASE tweets, like and retweet the pinned tweet, tag your member of Congress using the hashtag #WeKeepLeading, and congressional Twitter handles are available at this website that's posted. Also, please know that as soon as the webinar is over, a recording as well as the full complete PowerPoint presentation will be posted on the website. We also have provided you with an example of how you might tag your member of Congress. You can see here from a post that we've given as an example. Dr. Kevin Rubenstein has shared a picture and where we talk about very specifically temporary targeted flexibilities, and want to encourage you to continue to join us in using that language. We also next, when continuing to talk about temporary and targeted flexibility, we'll release an action alert to be sent by CASE members to your members of Congress in the next week. We'll also be utilizing every aspect of social media, and we'll provide the resources so that you can do the same. On Wednesday, we'll be holding a briefing for the members of Congress and their staff about these flexibilities. We're very excited to be engaging in that opportunity to share firsthand what CASE believes is necessary in order for each of our teachers and our administrators, again, those people who are implementing the IDEA daily, that their voice be heard. At this time, as we move through our presentation, I will turn it over to Myrna Manlawitz, again, our CASE policy and legislative consultant, as she is going to provide you some updates from Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to be with you again today. If we can go on to the next slide. I'm going to take up as little time as I can because I know you want to hear the meat of the presentation, but just to remind you that CASE has a tab now on the front page, on our home page on the website with all the resources that we're collecting, and we're continually updating that for your benefit. So please check there regularly to see all the wonderful information. Hopefully it will be useful for you, and if there are things that we can add that you might have, please let us know about those as well. Okay. Next slide. I wanted to spend most of my time with you this afternoon on talking about the CARES Act. This is the bill that already passed at the end of March that will be providing those additional funds to you in your school districts. There are several pieces to this. The first overarching piece There's a very large pot of money that was set out in the bill for relief for education, both at the K-12 level and higher education, as well as some money for childcare and so forth. And we're going to focus in for just a couple minutes on the K-12 funding. I'm going to start with the governor's emergency education relief fund, because that's the piece that's already in play. They this week came out with an application with information for the governors. They were talking to the governors this week in the middle of the week from the Department of Education to explain how this will all work. What I would say at the outset is that you, through whatever channels are appropriate in your state, need to be letting the governors know the need for these funds that will be coming down to school districts. And for two reasons. Number one, because obviously we want to let them know the situation on the ground and make sure they know that school districts are doing the best they can, but what they need, what other resources they need. But also, as we move into discussion of the next package in Congress, that the governors will have the ammunition they need to do what we call in Washington plussing up this account, so that there may be additional funds coming forward. The $3 billion, as you can see, is the amount of money that's in this emergency relief fund, and it will go out to the states based on a formula, 60% of the funding on the basis of population of people, of children and adults aged 5 through 24, and the additional 40% of funding will be based on the number of children counted under the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, or Every Student Succeeds Act. And the governors, of course, will be in charge of getting that money out. The money, it can be used for expenses retroactive to March 13th, which was the date of the emergency declaration from the president. So there, if you have already expended monies, you can backfill with some of these dollars that you will get. The money is for emergency support through grants to LEAs, where the state has deemed those LEAs as the most significantly impacted by the virus, and hopefully to support those educational services. The same also, there will be money available to your higher ed institutions in your states, and some money also, I believe, for the provision of child care and early childhood education, for social and emotional support, and protecting education-related jobs. So this is quite a flexible pot of money that will be available coming to the states through the governor's offices. The second pot of money is the middle bar there, the Education Stabilization Fund discretionary grants, again, through the governor's offices, specifically targeted within each state to the districts that are hardest hit. So that has not gone out yet as far as I know, and I believe that will be done through an application process. The third part of money is the actual relief fund for elementary and secondary, $13.5 billion, and that will be sent out on based on the Title I formula. That we are expecting that this week there will be discussion, and perhaps the application will be available this coming week for that pot of money, and there's an expedited process to get all this money out to the states and to the school districts as quickly as possible. Just quickly, as a reminder of what those funds can be used for, it can be used specifically for any activity that's authorized under the IDEA, under ESSA, under Career and Technical Education, and under McKinney-Vento as well, the Homeless Education Assistance Act. It can be used for principals and school leaders to have additional resources to address the needs of individual schools, and also to address the unique needs of certain populations of students, including low-income children, children with disabilities, English language learners, racial and ethnic minorities, homeless, foster youth, and including how to outreach and deliver services to each of those populations. And three other things I would mention quickly: purchasing educational technology, which of course we know in some school districts is critical, given the situation where not everyone is online or has the hardware available to them. And it also includes connectivity to the internet. And also assistive technology or adaptive equipment for students with disabilities. Two other things: providing mental health services and supports, and then the big question, which we will be discussing a little bit later on the webinar, planning and implementing activities related to summer learning and supplemental after-school programs and other online things that will, online learning that will take place possibly during the summer months. Okay, we can go on to the next slide. So what's happening in DC? Well, it's all COVID all the time here. I hate to make light of it, but that is pretty much all we're talking about. We are expecting that the Secretary will deliver her report to Congress coming up toward the end of the month, which was that piece in the CARES Act that required that she provide recommendations to Congress, to both the authorizing and the appropriations committees, on any flexibilities that are needed in the IDEA or in ESSA or in the Career and Technical Education Act. We're seeing the groups lining up on different sides of this issue. The disability advocacy groups, the parent groups, a number of civil rights groups have signed a letter basically stating that they want to see no waivers of anything in IDEA. As Phyllis mentioned at the outset, cases in the same camp, we are not asking for any waiver of the IDEA, but we are, of course, asking for flexibilities as clearly outlined in the letter that we sent to the Secretary, and the letter that is pretty much the same letter that's gone to Congress, to all members of the education committees in both the House and the Senate. And we have been joined in that effort by the National Association of State Directors of Special Ed. And we know now also that the principals associations, both the elementary and secondary principals, have sent a similar letter. I'm also aware that the school psychologists have sent a letter basically asking for the same kinds of flexibilities that the CASE and NASD letter included. And the principals associations actually got most all of their state affiliates as well to sign on to the letter, much as CASE did in the letter that they sent up to Congress. I will also add that CASE is providing webinars. Phyllis has been doing webinars. We'll be doing one this week coming up for the secondary principals, and another one for the elementary principals at the beginning of May. So these issues around IDEA are really critically important for all the administrators, as you know from your own experiences running the programs and making sure that students with disabilities are getting appropriate services. Congress is not coming back at least till May 4th, but most likely we're hearing now a little bit later than that. They are having significant issues around how they can vote and so forth safely, because right now they really don't have a platform or proposal to be able to vote electronically, so they're trying to figure all of that out. And as for the next package, there are beginning discussions, but we think it will be a few weeks out before we see the next package that will include hopefully more funding and maybe some of the flexibilities that we are requesting. So I will now turn it over to Erin and Kevin to give you a little more information.
Thank you so much, Myrna. And we're grateful to have all of you with us again. Our goal for this next section of the presentation is to bring you into a set of conversations that have been swirling around in many of the question sets that we have been receiving. And that is about considering our summer and extended school year services, as well as the potential impact of COVID-19 on student progress. So Kevin and I will be bouncing back and forth again and talking with you a little bit about our perspectives as it relates to that topic. So Kevin is going to enter us into that conversation through a discussion about the most recent research that came out. Kevin?
Right. Thank you so much, Erin. So many of you have probably seen a whole bunch of graphs that have been published. They were originally published by the 74 Million, which is an online publication. And it was actually research done by NWEA, which is an organization that puts out the MAP assessment. What they talked about there was the fact that when students head back to school next fall, overall, they're likely to retain about 70% of this year's gains in reading compared with a typical school year. They're likely to retain less than 50% of what they gained in math. And that those losses are likely to be more pronounced in the early grades, and among those already facing steep inequities. So students with disabilities, students from EL backgrounds, students living in poverty. The article went on to actually talk about some past situations in other countries where I think it was in Argentina where there had been an ongoing teacher strike for many, many months where children were out of school, and the generational challenges that caused, that they were still measuring, that the children who were in school at that time that they were now talking about in their 30s and 40s, that generational impact could be felt on students who were the adults who were in their 30s and 40s and their children. So we need to keep that in mind as we are planning for extended school year and as we're planning for the impact of COVID-19. So as we think it through for the pandemic, we need to remember that as written in IDEA, ESY is left to the states to define, and it's required for students if it's necessary to receive FAPE as defined by the IEP team. So your states are going to have more specific guidance about which students should be eligible for ESY. Erin, you want to pick up from there?
Sure. I think it's important for all of you to hear as well that as we begin to talk about extended school year and we think about the loss of progress that may take place for some students over this COVID pandemic, that we really tried to enter this conversation both through what we know is right and best for students, as well as how it intersects with the law. And so we know that ESY was added to IDEA. We know that there are a variety of definitions, as Kevin said, but that it wasn't developed to resolve the circumstances within the context of COVID. And we are going to talk a little bit about how we think that might play out. I would like to, before we go any further, just remember what Phyllis said in the beginning of this webinar, that we are giving you our best thinking and we're giving it to you in the context of what we know now. But and I think maybe the next slide is the right one to move to, which is that, you know, we are thinking about how to move into this from the perspective of ESY in light of COVID-19. And in many states, regression is a framework that is used for ESY, but there are multiple perspectives that are held for ESY in each state. And so as we talk this through, it's important to keep in mind whatever ESY means in your state specifically. But as we began to try to develop a context to think about summer programming as it relates to FAPE, right? ESY is expected if it's necessary in order to provide a free appropriate public education to a student, that there's some really important data to analyze as we think about the topic. So we're going to talk first about what data to collect. You really want to think about analyzing the data as it relates to where kids were when schools closed. As we've done a lot of analysis about this topic, understanding where students were at the time schools closed will be really important in order to figure out the impact of COVID-19. And the impact of COVID-19 is a conversation to be had as it relates to resolving some of that, but it is not actually the purpose of ESY. ESY is to be thought of as services that are necessary from the point school ends at the end of the year until it starts again in the fall. And so making sure that we consider ESY based on prior regression data, just as you have, or other data points that are expected of you inside of thinking about ESY, making sure that you think about ESY based on regression data or the other data points that you collect typically, to think about what you need to put into place in an IEP in order to address summer issues that happen for students. We are actually recommending at this point, given the thinking to date, that we think about that somewhat separately from the impact of COVID-19. Now, services that you choose to address these issues may dovetail, but we think it's really important that maintaining documentation of the services offered during the COVID-19 school closures and the IEP goal progress across that time frame is also an important data set to collect, because that will help you think about what is the actual impact of the COVID-19 closure on students, as opposed to confusing it with regression as it relates to developing a program for ESY. And then during the summer, you might do both. You might be thinking about services for ESY. You might think about COVID impact. Maybe some districts do something over the summer, but we will also need to be thinking about the fall and curriculum and mapping, remapping, hiring changes, and staffing in the fall as it relates to all of this. I think it's important, and I'm going to turn it over to Kevin for additional comments as well, to remember that the impact of COVID-19 is on all students. This is not just around students with disabilities. It is important to note that there may be students with disabilities who are much more impacted by COVID-19 and the school closures than other students. And so that's important to know and understand, which is the reason we're recommending careful collection of data during the closure, and wrapping the conversation of COVID-19 impact into your overarching school structures from our perspective feels important. And that's why you see the plan for the fall with curriculum mapping and remapping. You may need to implement more services or not for certain students based on what's taken place and where you find yourself in the fall when you arrive back. And again, you may choose to address some of these things in the summer as well. So Kevin, what would you like to add to that?
Yeah, that was excellent. I think that, you know, some of the big pieces here are that what I'm hearing from schools in our area, in the Chicago area, across Illinois, and really across the country, are people sort of saying, you know, we're having IEP team meetings now, and people are concerned about regression and ability to recoup after, you know, this time away from school, so to speak. And so they're adding ESY into the IEP. Now, if that's what the IEP team decides, then by all means, go ahead and add that. I think that what we need to be really careful of is making sure that we're considering all of that really carefully, that we really think of the COVID-19 time, the place here in the blue center, March 2020 through probably June 2020 in many places, as really a separate and different time. Because as Erin said, this is going to be there's going to be regression for all kids. Remember what that NWEA research said, that students are probably going to retain about 70% of what they did, you know, compared to a typical year in reading, and about 50% of what they did in a typical year for math. And it's going to be even more significant for kids who are sort of on the margins. So let's break that down a little bit. There are going to be 3 key data points for all students. And we're not talking just students with disabilities here. We're really talking about all students here. So end of in-person instruction, and really for students with disabilities, where were they performing on IEP goals? So for my school district, it's really actually an easy thing because right before we left, we had the end of a trimester, and so we have some really good data about where students were at sort of right towards the end of in-person instruction. If that's data that you didn't necessarily gather, that's fine. You can go back and look at the most recent endpoint data that you had from NamesWeb or from a progress monitoring chart or some of those other goal monitoring systems that you use in the school year. Then the second data point that you're going to want to gather there is where are the students at, where are all students at the end of the school year. So whenever that might be. In my school district, our students are scheduled to get out on June 2nd this year. So if the end of the school year comes on June 2nd in your school district, where are they performing on IEP goals, and what impact, if any, has COVID-19 had on them and on their learning and on their IEP goals? And for the rest of the students in your classes and in your school district, you're going to want to think about how might you want to do an informal assessment. How are you going to assess the impact of COVID-19 just on regular instruction between March 2020, when most school districts got out, and the end of the school year? Then all students typically experience some sort of summer slide. And so we need to think about then how we're going to assess everybody at the beginning of the school year. What happened over the summer and how does that compare to peers? So for students with disabilities, you're going to be able to sort of plot that out and really see that as a different piece there than the other students in your classes and in your school district about what that should actually look like. So 3 really key points of data that you're going to want to dive into there in your school district. Erin,
Yeah, I did want to just add that I think it's really important, no matter what direction your state takes, that this set of data will be really valuable. And it's important from a case perspective that we are meaningful for all of you, all the way across the nation. And because none of this has happened before, there will likely be direction from your Department of Education. And it's really important that you pay careful attention to that. But one of the things we believe, and why we put this together, is that these data points will likely be helpful for you regardless of what direction your department goes around ESY and any kind of direction that a state might set as a direction for school districts to address the impact of COVID-19. There's nothing that stops states from deciding how they're going to handle that. There's nothing that stops districts from at least maintaining the law and then going above and beyond. But we did feel like this set of data and recommending this collection would be beneficial, again, in whatever direction your department goes with ESY, as well as with COVID-19 impact consideration.
Yep. So, Erin, you want to take that next slide?
Sure. Just a reminder that the constructs we have legally have not ever considered, we've said this a lot, COVID-19. And so while we might use information about regression or progress on IEP goals to think about the impact of COVID-19, ESY was not technically designed to address that. But especially for those districts that are offering a FAPE during this time. It is also important to remember, and we want to be very clear about this, that the most effective school districts will always collaborate in good faith effort with parents and families to be proactive, and that includes addressing the impact of COVID-19. We are waiting to hear if OSEP will speak to the expectation of impact of COVID-19. We're waiting to hear from our departments, but CASE believes that this is important for students, and how we go about that matters. So as Myrna said earlier, there will be CARES Act funding in the future to provide instruction for students. That's coming through in different ways, and we know that there are further negotiations happening in Washington about funding. CASE is very supportive of increased funding for students with disabilities related to the impact of COVID-19, and we'll speak to that as well into the future. But keep your eyes open and your ear to the ground as it relates to the CARES Act funding and how that might play out. And then this is something that we've talked about previously as well in prior webinars, but we'd like to remind you that compensatory education for students with disabilities is a legal remedy where the school district has not provided FAPE. And if that is the framework for resolution of the impact of COVID-19, we don't really see that as the appropriate vehicle if you've offered FAPE during this time. If you've offered FAPE during this time, there is sort of information out there that may become a struggle in some places, but compensatory education for students with disabilities within this framework has the potential to really create some problems in the system. And so our goal is to be much more systemic about that than challenges with compensatory ed student by student, or using compensatory education legal analysis as a framework for resolution. We think that it's really important that we get much more holistic about it, that we think about all students, that we consider the impact of COVID-19, that we have an ethical obligation to our students to ensure that if we can, we resolve impact of COVID-19 if it's possible, and that we're planful about that with our colleagues and leaders in our school districts and as well as nationally. Kevin, anything else you'd like to add on that slide?
That is great. That's perfect. So for now, what we are encouraging people to do is to plan for how you're going to add the current information from any temporary learning plans to a student's IEP. So just as, you know, I know that as of today, there are 27 states or American territories that have closed schools for the rest of the year by mandate of their governor. And so those principals in all of those school buildings are probably thinking about, how do all the kids get their supplies out of the rooms, and how do the teachers pack up for the summer if they need to pack up, and those sorts of things. It's your job as a special education administrator to be thinking about, how am I going to make sure that all of these temporary learning plans that are being written, how are they going to get into the students' IEPs in the fall? What's my plan look like? It has to be highly coordinated and organized. If you are just allowing things to go free fall, and allowing every single person on your team to do it differently, it's not going to be effective or efficient when you come back to school in the fall. You're going to want to plan for how you're going to assess students at the end of the year, whenever that might be. And for some of you, that's going to be coming up here relatively soon. We know that end of instruction for students in Indiana, we heard, is May 7th. So that's coming up right around the corner. You're going to want to look for ways to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 over the summer for all students. So think through the idea, in my own school district, we were thinking we may provide just access to our summer online learning programs to all students. And what does that look like? Could we use CARES Act funding for that? Could we pay some teachers to work with students virtually and to provide some check-ins and to do some of those sorts of things, not formally through ESY, as we talked about before, but as an additional piece here to help to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 over the summer. We wouldn't just do it for students with disabilities. We would probably do it for many of our students who are at risk. So some of our EL students, some of our students from low-income backgrounds, those sorts of things. So look for ways to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 over the summer. You're going to want to be planning for assessments of students in the fall and really think about does it need to be different? Is it typical? Is it going to be your typical assessment system? Does it need to look any different than it typically does? Because I can speak for my own district that we are working with our curriculum people to sort of say we may need to do some curriculum compacting and to look at what that looks like for our students with disabilities. We need to look at how we're going to teach all students the formal lessons that we're not able to get to because we've now actually had, while we're starting to deliver new instruction now, there's really about a 3 to 4 week gap that we were not able to give formal instruction there. So while we're getting to that now, there's going to be some curriculum compacting that probably has to take place. And then you're going to want to look at staffing patterns and any adjustments that might need to be made as a result of that data collection. So do you need to look at hiring some additional staff? Do you need to, and is there money for that? Do you need to look at any other pieces there, and what is your plan for doing that over the summer? Because going into this in the fall, or sort of saying to yourself, I'm really exhausted with COVID-19, and we all are. We are really exhausted with COVID-19 right now, but sort of saying to yourself, I just want to put this all behind me and attack it in the fall isn't really a fair plan to yourself or to your students or families in your district. Anything to add there, Erin?
No, I don't think so, Kevin. Just to wrap this section up by recognizing that we are working to be creative in our own school districts, and know you are too, and to remind you that this is our best thinking to date, and we might come up with some other new ideas that we will continue to share with you as we think through as we move now into legal considerations in this phase of COVID-19 service implementation with our good friend Julie Weatherly, who we are so excited to bring back to you to talk a little bit about some of the legal aspects of the ideas that we've shared. So I'd like to go ahead and hand it over to Julie, and then after that, we'll take some questions.
Thank you, Erin. Wow, another incredibly great job by Myrna, Kevin, and Erin. Thank you so much. So if you have been tuning in to these wonderful case webinars, you've noticed, particularly when we started getting into priorities, that legal is last. And though I'm the lawyer in the group, I'm happy to be last because it does probably need to take the back seat in terms of concerns. But it is a concern, obviously, that we need to address with you every time we do one of these. So if we move to the next slide, just a couple of pointers. Many of them are just reminders, but we are kind of in a different phase right now as it relates to the summer moving closer and closer. But some reminders, particularly with respect to this first one, the procedural compliance issues. I'm continuing still to get lots and lots of questions, a lot of time being spent with respect to preparing written notices and parent agreements and all of the somewhat what I might call obsession with all of the, yes, important, but in light of COVID-19, perhaps not so much, because as we've already discussed, IDEA clearly was not written for all of this certain pandemic, and we can't allow it to paralyze what we need to be doing for students. Getting too obsessed with these procedural issues, whether we get the flexibility or not at this point, is almost moot, because as Myrna indicated, Congress isn't going to really be looking at this anytime soon, perhaps. And I do understand the thought of corrective action and enforcement and how worried folks get about that. But my bottom line has always been, and I've been singing the same tune, do the best you can as soon as you can and document with respect to those issues. Secondly, and most importantly, in my world, continue to exercise the good PR and customer service skills and encourage folks to do that. Unfortunately, I am hearing some stories from parents who are saying that they haven't even been contacted other than having some sort of packet delivered to the home or what have you. Well, those are the kind of parents that are going to have an advocate or lawyer on speed dial. And that's why I like these 3 C's here: compassion, communication, and collaboration. It's going to lessen those complaints and lawsuits. You know, the medical community has spent millions of dollars in researching why it is that medical practitioners, some of them get sued more than others. And what they found essentially is, in comparing, let's say, 2 surgeons who left the same amount or same number of sponges in their patients during a surgery, what they found is it doesn't really matter as long as there's a good bedside manner or that compassion, listening to patients and that kind of thing. They're less likely to be sued if they have a good bedside manner. So we need to think about that, particularly in light of the situation that we're in. The next 2 bullets in the next slide deal with exactly what's been talked about here. When we were planning this webinar, I think we all agreed that this is now moving into the phase toward 6 to 8 weeks out for the summer break. Need to be thinking about the individualized determinations regarding every student's need for extended school year services. ESY was my very first project when I got out of law school in terms of what I was assigned to work on for a large school district that I was working with. And it was primarily because the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals in Georgia had issued an ESY decision saying that a 180-day school year for everybody may not provide FAPE to some students with disabilities. It's a court-created phenomenon that doesn't even appear in the IDEA itself. It only appears in the IDEA regulations, and that wasn't even until 2006. So it is, the point that I'm trying to make is it's really important to follow your state and local guidelines, because in general, those are based on court decisions in your jurisdiction. Even if you don't have an ESY court decision in your jurisdiction, many states still have borrowed from those because they provide good factors to consider. And most often we see regression and recoupment. But that's the data side of things, which is important, but there are other considerations and other factors that many of the courts have said are important that have been incorporated into state and local guidelines. The federal law itself basically just tells us that ESY services need to be individualized. That means essentially you have to make the decision annually for each individual child and decide whether it's necessary for FAPE. And also the federal regulations tell us that you can't limit ESY services to particular categories of disability. So be real careful about that. As always, we're not going to say we're only going to provide it to our severely and profoundly disabled students. And federal law says that we can't unilaterally limit the type and or duration of the services. So we wouldn't want to say either that, hey, we're going to do a little bit of ESY, but it's only going to be from June 15 to July 16 for everybody, or something like that. That's not individualized. Or we're going to do home packets for everybody. That won't be individualized either. It needs to be based on the individual needs resulting from the child's disability, not the impact of COVID-19, when we're looking at eligibility for ESY. So the next slide and the final slide, I've continued to hear a lot of concern expressed on the part of special educators, and I don't blame them, about compensatory services or compensatory education. And I keep saying, let's don't necessarily worry about that right now. I even have gotten so annoyed by it, I've decided to coin, along with a friend of mine, we have coined an alternative, and I like always to have a little acronym myself, CISS, COVID Impact Services and Supports. But we'll be taking a look at that later on when school buildings reopen. So those are my legal thoughts for this webinar, and I will just hand it off to the next person.
All right. Thank you, Julie. As we move on through the rest, we are going to have some time for some questions. We have some really good ones, but it's important, we believe, from a case perspective, that we continue to remind you of the priorities, what our first priority is and what our fourth priority is. And these are intentionally in an order. We think it is most important that you do take care of yourselves and your families. And as we move through navigating, we do all of those pieces of documentation, looking at FAPE in light of the circumstances, and then complying and documenting that through compliance as much as possible. I want to thank each of our presenters for the content that they've provided today and the time that they have spent preparing for the webinar. And at this point in time, I'd like to move into some questions. There are two questions around the funding, and I would first and foremost like to throw this to Myrna, and then maybe Erin might have something to throw in as well. So we talk about the CARES Act and what they can be used for. Myrna mentioned some of that at the beginning, but the question is, our senator mentioned that possibly funds from the CARES Act could be used instead of cutting teacher pay. It looks like that the state is cutting the teacher pay by 20%. And if pay is cut by teachers, could some of that funding be used in place?
Thanks, Phyllis, for the question. One of the things, well, first of all, I'll reiterate that the law does allow for any activity authorized under the IDEA. So, of course, we know that a good percentage of that money often goes to pay for your personnel. So please think about that. But another thing that it says specifically is that these funds can be used, and I'm quoting this, for other activities that are necessary to maintain the operation of and continuity of services in LEAs and continuing to employ existing staff of the LEA. So I would read that to say that, you know, anything you can do using these funds to keep your staff intact would be allowed under the CARES Act. What I will also say is generally when the application will go out for something like this, there will be, of course, some instructions and guidance. So hopefully that will be included when that package is released, maybe in the next week or so. So I don't know if Erin has anything she'd like to add.
I think what I would add is whenever you have a question like that, part of me always wants to recommend that you check at the state level and then also with your local attorney, because if the state makes some kind of requirement about not doing that, or allows it, or it's expected, you'll want to know that. And then always when you're thinking about reducing the amount of pay as it relates to contracts that were already signed by teachers, you'll want to consult with your attorney as it relates to labor issues that may take place. And if you're thinking specifically only about special educators, that would likely be an issue versus thinking about all staff, and your superintendent would also obviously want to be involved. So I think there are probably lots of questions that would need to be asked at the local and state level, along with the recommendation that Myrna provided about how the money can be used.
Phyllis, just to add one more thing that, you know, in looking through this, one of the other things that it says in the CARES Act, and again, these are the kinds of things that will need clarification. It says that as a condition of receiving the grant money, the school district must continue to pay its employees and contractors to, quote, the greatest extent practicable during the period of disruption or closures due to the coronavirus. So again, what that means, and I think Erin's comment is of course spot on about making sure that you're looking at your contractual obligations and so forth. It's unclear whether the federal government could still grant the money to a district if they can't continue to employ all their staff. So I think that that is something that will need clarification as states apply for and receive these funds.
Thank you, Myrna. I think still along the same lines of what the CARES Act is saying. Myrna, you mentioned this, I think, in your initial presentation, but I'll ask Myrna to comment on this next question, as well as Julie might have a comment. I think, Myrna, the language referred to the hardest hit, and the question is hardest hit, in quotes, defined by cases of COVID-19 or some other indicator?
As often is the case in federal law or state law, there is no definition in there that I have found of what hardest hit means. And I think from what I have read so far, and in both reports and in the language itself, that it looks like it's up to the state to make the determination. I'm assuming, this is just me, one person making the assumption that that will be, the largest number of cases, but I think it's up to the state to make that determination. I don't know if Julie's heard anything differently.
Yeah, Julie, any comment?
No, I really haven't. I actually just became aware of it yesterday morning, and yeah, I always going to defer to Myrna on trying to figure out language that has been put out by Congress. So it remains to be seen. I will say, though, that we really need to get to the state departments of education as special education directors and school board attorneys to advocate to make sure that the funds are equitably distributed amongst the students, for sure. So we need to take action, because I think the funds are rolling out fairly soon.
Right, absolutely.
All right. Thank you. Kevin, I'm going to toss this next question to you. As we track services offered, should we also consider how the families have availed themselves of services? If they refuse or are unable to participate for a variety of reasons, would that be valuable data to address regression?
Absolutely. You should be tracking every bit of interaction that you're having, I would say, with parents and families. So what we are encouraging our own educators to do here is to, when they are attempting to interact with a student, and the student is not coming to a lesson, or not able to engage, or you're attempting to contact a parent and they are saying we're not ready yet, or they may not be responding at all, to continue to document those things. We don't know exactly why those parents are not engaging. It could be because they don't want the services. It could be because they are experiencing, an internet outage. It could be because of a number of factors. And so we need to make sure that we are just documenting our good faith efforts to engage with those families. And then if and when they come back to us in the fall, to work with those families and work with that student to sort of say, let's pick up where we are and assess exactly where they're at and be able to move forward from there. So absolutely, that documentation piece that we have talked about in our priority number 3 is going to become crucial to everybody in the fall.
Thank you, Kevin. I think we have time for one more question. I'm going to toss this to Julie first and then to Erin, so we get 2 different perspectives on it. So Julie, if a student does not participate, in other words, they don't show up, they're not in attendance, in distance education expectations, despite our great effort on part of the school, FAPE and compensatory education would not be a school obligation. Is that correct?
Yes, that is clearly, in my mind, correct. Not necessarily sure that all of the parent advocates and attorneys would agree with me on that, but based on my reaction to, though Andrew was not decided thinking about this pandemic, we still go back to that language of in light of the circumstances. And part of the circumstance is the student is not showing up. And then we talk about our good faith, reasonable efforts, and a parent's refusal to engage, a student's refusal to engage is clearly going to impact on the circumstances of the student and reflective of our good faith, reasonable efforts to determine why, to follow up with parents, to make sure maybe they said no at the beginning, but maybe we need to check in with them again. All those good faith, reasonable efforts that are documented. And if you still get no response, then that is going to go to the FAPE issue.
Thanks, Julie. I would agree with everything Julie just said. And then I would go back to what we recommended earlier in the webinar about making sure you understand the impact of COVID-19 for whatever reason that it might be taking place. So maybe part of the reason that there is a lack of progress or even regression might be about non-participation. Maybe some of it's about participation, but it didn't work well. We've never done this before. And so understanding what the impact is, I think, is really important, and then being able to think about that upon return. I would offer one other question that I think is going to be really important to ask ourselves when we return in the fall, assuming we can, which is looking hopeful to me. How much service can a student sustain without exhaustion? And also being able to stay within appropriate learning research. I'm worried a little bit about trying to make up for all of this time, particularly if you have a student who wasn't engaged, and then creating an impossible situation for a student. I think we have to stay really student-centered about what makes sense for students, and I think that it's a bad idea to be instructing students for 10 hours a day. I don't think that's a reasonable expectation for any student. And so I think that is probably going to be a question that we need to ask ourselves as we end up in a situation where we're finally understanding what the impact is. But I agree with Julie. I don't think compensatory ed and right to services related to refusal will be showing up as a formal requirement. I do wonder what we'll be required to do as a whole system of repairing some of the impact of COVID-19, and want to hold students and families in the center about what can actually be done without being too invasive with too much instruction for students and what they can handle.
All right, thank you so very much, panelists, for answering all of our questions. We've gone just a couple minutes over. Just to remind everyone to stay up to date on resources and information, please be sure and visit the CEC and the CASE websites. That information is on your screen in the PowerPoint. Want to thank each of you for participating today. Join us next Friday where we will continue to offer updates, provide some additional information as we think through this process, as well as continue to answer your questions. So thank you very much again for joining CASE as we navigate COVID-19, this pandemic.